I officially transferred the ownership of our house to my parents, as Charles and I were contemplating divorce. With a cold, detached demeanor, Charles pointed at me and callously demanded that I leave the house. He unleashed a barrage of insults, all while his parents sat there with cheerful smiles, silently supporting his actions. Despite their harsh words, I remained unfazed. I had anticipated this moment, prepared myself both mentally and emotionally. I had packed my bags ahead of time, and without hesitation, I calmly walked out of the house. They had no idea of the storm that was about to hit them, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation they had created. My name is Mary, and I recently turned 55. Many years have passed since Charles and I first got married, and our children are now grown and living independent lives far from us. I used to live the life of an ordinary salaried worker, but now, thanks to a friend's introduction, I spend my days teaching others how to make handmade accessories a hobby that has turned into a fulfilling profession. This new chapter in my life has brought me immense joy and satisfaction. Every day, I find fulfillment in my interactions with my students, and the simple act of crafting has become a source of comfort and peace for me. Some might frown upon turning a hobby into a career, but I am genuinely content. Charles and I met by chance at the company where I used to work. He was employed at a client company, and through work-related events and social gatherings, our relationship grew stronger. Eventually, we fell in love and decided to marry. 5 years into our marriage, we were blessed with a beautiful, healthy son. He grew up to be a bright young man, graduated from a prestigious university, and is now happily married and living a successful, fulfilling life. Despite our son's achievements, the relationship between Charles and me deteriorated over time. The once loving and considerate man I married slowly transformed into someone I could hardly recognize. Charles became demanding, treating me more like a servant than a partner. His constantly shifting demands and preferences became an unbearable burden, and nothing I did seemed to please him. Lately, he's been quick to anger, blaming me for the most trivial things. Verbal abuse has become more frequent, leaving me feeling emotionally drained and worn down. As much as I tried to maintain peace and keep our family together, it became clear that the person Charles had become was not someone I could continue to live with. The love and respect that once defined our marriage had eroded, replaced by anger and resentment. Walking away from the house, I knew this was the right decision, not just for me, but for my future. It was time to reclaim my peace, my happiness, and my sense of self. Though our marriage spanned many years and was once filled with love and promise, I could no longer ignore the reality of our situation. I had given Charles countless chances to change, to recognize how much he was hurting me, but those chances went unacknowledged. Now, as I step into this new phase of my life, I'm filled with a sense of relief, knowing that I've made the right choice for myself. It's not easy to walk away from a life you've built with someone, but sometimes it's necessary to let go in order to find your own happiness. I've been longing to escape this life and start fresh, but I'm tied down by an unpaid mortgage. To make matters worse, Charles quit his job out of nowhere, giving no clear reason, and now spends his days lounging around the house. He hardly lifts a finger to help with anything, leaving me to manage all the chores and responsibilities on my own. The house we live in was recently rebuilt, and I was the one who made it happen. I saved money little by little, carefully managing the finances to fund its reconstruction. This house represents so much more than just a place to live. It embodies my dreams, my hard work, and everything I've wished for. It's a home I poured my heart into, and I can't stand the thought of it falling into Charles's hands if I leave. Beyond the mortgage issue, this house is a symbol of my aspirations. I was meticulous in its design, making sure to include features like a spacious kitchen, something I've always wanted. While Charles had some input at the beginning, I was the one who covered all the costs, and I hoped my wishes would be respected. Despite the difficulties we faced along the way, the house finally became a reality, complete with all the features I had dreamed of. I felt an overwhelming sense of joy when we moved in. Seeing my hard work turn into something tangible was incredibly fulfilling. However, the cost of construction ended up being far higher than we initially estimated. We had no choice but to take on a much larger loan than anticipated. Taking on such a significant financial burden in our 55s was a tough decision, but I believed the happiness our new home promised would make it worth the effort. For me, the house was a dream realized. But Charles? He wasn't as thrilled. He sulked, his complaints lingering because his opinions weren't as reflected in the final design as he'd hoped. He even went so far as to say the house was a waste of money, comparing it to throwing cash down the drain. Ignoring his grumbling, I pressed forward, knowing the house was everything I had hoped for. But his attitude worsened. Gradually, Charles stopped talking to me, resorting to childish behavior like leaving trash scattered around and disorganizing the house on purpose, small, spiteful acts aimed at irritating me. Each day, I wondered when this tension would end, when I could finally break free from this toxic cycle. These thoughts weighed on my mind constantly as I tried to navigate the delicate balance between my love for the home I built and the strained marriage that now threatened to suffocate me. A few months after we moved into the new house, something unexpected happened. The doorbell rang one afternoon. We weren't expecting any visitors, so I was curious about who it could be. As I prepared to head to the door, Charles, surprisingly, got up before I could. It struck me as odd since he rarely made any effort to be involved in anything these days. It seemed like he knew who the visitor was. After a short while, cheerful voices and laughter came from the entrance, a stark contrast to the usual tension in our home. When the door to the living room slowly opened, it revealed the visitors. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the faces of my unexpected in-laws, Kevin and Carolyn. Seeing them was always a source of tension for me. From the moment Charles and I announced our marriage, they treated me coldly, criticizing me for my lower social status and showing an awkward attitude, even on our wedding day. Their interference didn't stop after the wedding either, and each encounter with them left me feeling uneasy, always wondering how to handle the situation. Over time, as our contact with them decreased, I thought things might have settled down. That's why their sudden visit caught me off guard. I greeted them politely, trying to mask the slight tension I felt, but they walked right past me without so much as a word, one of them even bumping into my shoulder, as if I weren't there. They immediately began marveling at the house, particularly the spacious, user-friendly kitchen that I had designed with so much care. Charles, now eager and proud, gave them a full tour of the house, showing off all the details. When they returned to the living room, their expressions seemed satisfied, as though they were impressed. But then, Charles's face hardened, and suddenly, he raised his voice at me, demanding that I hurry and prepare tea and snacks for his parents. His tone caught me off guard, and I rushed to get everything ready as quickly as I could. Despite my best efforts, Kevin and Carolyn seemed dissatisfied, making subtle remarks about the hospitality. Kevin, in particular, barely finished his tea before expressing his dissatisfaction, though he did take a moment to compliment the interior of the house. Then, with a broad smile on his face, Charles invited his parents to live with us in the house. He spoke as if I wasn't even there, as if my thoughts and feelings didn't matter. His parents seemed to take his words seriously, and left soon after, satisfied with the idea. As I watched them leave, I couldn't help but feel the enormous gap between Charles and me widening further. He was laughing and chatting with his parents, something I hadn't seen him do in a long time, and it reminded me of how distant he had become from me. After that day, Charles's parents began visiting more frequently. At first, it was just a few times a month, but soon their visits increased to several times a week. Before I knew it, they were coming over nearly every day. And with each visit, their criticisms of me intensified. No matter what I did, it was never good enough for them, and Charles never stood up for me. In fact, he started blaming me more, too. He constantly complained that I didn't listen, and he even accused me of causing stress for our son, which felt like a baseless attack. Despite how frustrated and hurt I was, I couldn't seem to find the courage to speak up. Every time I wanted to defend myself, the words got stuck in my throat, and all I could do was offer apologies. The in-laws' visits didn't just increase, they started coming over even when I wasn't home, often arriving with Charles. I would return to find empty beer cans and bottles scattered around the house, and spilled alcohol soaking into the new rug I had bought with such care. The house, which I had worked so hard to make perfect, began to smell of alcohol and feel dirty. I protested, of course. I asked Charles to intervene, but he ignored me, brushing off my concerns. It was as if my feelings didn't matter anymore. The house I had dreamed of, the house that was supposed to be our sanctuary, was slowly becoming a place where I felt trapped and powerless. The more his parents came, the more I felt like a stranger in my own home, and the more distant Charles became from me. I couldn't understand why Charles, who contributed nothing to the household, was always the first to complain. His growing involvement in gambling added another layer of stress to my life. Almost daily, I would find discarded betting slips, constant reminders of his risky habit. No matter how many times I tried to explain the dangers of gambling and the impact it was having on our finances, my words fell on deaf ears. The losses were devastating, especially since the money he was gambling away was the result of my hard work and long hours. Nearly a month into the in-laws' frequent visits, they had become bolder, often coming over when I wasn't home. One day, I returned earlier than expected and found them lounging in my house as if it were their own. I confronted them, but their snarky remarks and dismissive attitude made it clear they considered my presence an inconvenience. Frustrated and stressed by the sheer audacity of Charles and his parents, I realized I had reached my breaking point. Instead of letting my emotions take over, I knew I had to come up with a plan to address the situation. During this chaotic time, something strange happened. The in-laws visited one day when I was supposed to be away. Their odd timing caught me off guard, and I sarcastically commented on how they always seemed to avoid me. Ignoring my remarks, they brazenly entered the house. Charles greeted them with a welcoming smile and led them on a tour, showing off different areas of the house, from the kitchen to the bathroom. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden agenda behind their visit. They inspected everything carefully, as if they were evaluating the place. When they left, they had satisfied expressions on their faces, as though they had confirmed something I wasn't aware of. Feeling uneasy, I questioned Charles about the inspections. He brushed off my concerns, telling me not to worry and insisting that it was none of my business. But his behavior made me suspect that he was hiding something from me. It felt like he was manipulating the situation, though I couldn't quite figure out what his endgame was. All I could do was observe and wait, hoping to uncover the truth. Then, one day, after a long day at work, I came home to find a large moving truck parked in front of our house. The truck had the logo of a moving company called Moving Center. I was stunned. As I approached, I saw Charles talking with the truck driver and some company representatives. When he noticed me, he quickly looked away and disappeared into the house, avoiding any eye contact. My heart sank, but the biggest shock came when my in-laws arrived at the same moment. They greeted me casually, as if nothing unusual was happening, and Charles welcomed them inside with open arms. The atmosphere felt tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I followed them into the house, my suspicions were confirmed. The furniture and belongings I had known for years were gone. In their place was my in-laws' old, dated furniture, arranged as though they were preparing to move in permanently. It was as if my home, the house I had worked so hard for, was being turned into theirs without my consent. I stood there in disbelief, trying to process what I was seeing. My world felt like it was spinning out of control, and it became clear that Charles had been planning this behind my back for some time. His parents seemed smug, as if they had finally taken over, while I was left standing in the middle of what used to be my home, feeling like an outsider. I sat down on the sofa, surrounded by Charles and his parents, all wearing smug smiles that made it clear they had something planned. Their behavior radiated confidence, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Despite feeling anxious, I decided to remain quiet and see how things would unfold. My in-laws exchanged hurried glances, and finally, they declared that they had something important to tell me, hinting at an ulterior motive. Bracing myself, I tried to stay calm. Charles let out a deep sigh before revealing what I had already suspected: he had sold the house to his parents. He then bluntly proposed a divorce, and his parents, nodding in agreement, looked pleased with themselves, their smirking faces showing that they had been plotting this all along. Despite the shocking revelation, I stayed composed. I had seen this coming and prepared myself for this moment. Without hesitation, I signed the divorce papers, took off my wedding ring, placed it on the table, and calmly declared that I would be leaving the house. For a while, I had been suspicious of Charles and his parents, especially with their increasing visits when I wasn't around. To confirm my doubts, I had installed hidden surveillance cameras around the house, connected to my phone. I monitored their conversations daily, and one day, I stumbled upon footage of Charles and his parents joyfully discussing their plan to sell the house. Shocked but determined, I knew I had to act quickly. In the days that followed, I quietly made plans for my next move. Using the information I gathered from the surveillance footage, I decided to transfer the home loan, which was still under my name, to Charles. If they wanted to kick me out of the house I worked so hard for, they could take on the mortgage as well. After all, the $5,500 monthly payments had always come from my hard-earned salary. I doubted that Charles and his parents, now unemployed, would be able to manage the payments without my help. I resolved not to provide any further financial support. Once everything was in place, I moved into my new home, a well-arranged, cozy space furnished with new items I had carefully chosen for this fresh start. I was finally free from the burdens of my old life, ready to begin a new chapter. On my first day off in my new place, I relished the idea of having some much-needed rest. I slept in late, enjoying the quiet peace of my new surroundings. But just as I was about to doze off again, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. To my surprise, Charles and his parents stood at my doorstep, uninvited. Without waiting for an answer, they barged into my home, clearly upset. They spread out a document in front of me and accused me of changing the name on the house loan without their permission. Apparently, they had received the paperwork shortly after I left, and it came as a shock to them. Their expressions of disbelief told me they hadn't anticipated this. Charles and his parents angrily explained that they were all unemployed and couldn't afford the high monthly payments. Charles, in a furious outburst, declared that they would not pay the loan, as if refusing to face the reality of the situation. Calmly, I tried to explain the consequences of defaulting on the mortgage. I told them how interest and late fees would add up, increasing the final amount they would owe. Charles seemed skeptical at first, but as he searched for information online, his expression quickly changed. The weight of what I had done finally sank in. Shock and distress crossed his face as he realized the financial burden that now rested solely on his shoulders. I suggested that they look for new jobs to make a fresh start. As the reality of the situation sank in, their faces grew even paler. They admitted they had no savings or assets to fall back on, and Charles was weighed down by substantial gambling debts with no stable income to rely on. Desperate, they pleaded with me for understanding and help, reminding me of the years we had spent together. But I remained unmoved by their pleas. After everything they had put me through, I wasn't going to fall back into the trap of helping them again. Frustrated by my refusal, they tried to guilt me into reconsidering, but I quickly shut the door on their attempts to mend the situation. Their desperation grew, and in a last-ditch effort, they reported me to the police, accusing me of changing the mortgage without their consent. It didn't take long for the authorities to intervene, and eventually, Charles and his parents were removed from my property. Facing severe financial difficulties, they were forced to move to a smaller, more affordable apartment on the outskirts of town. Charles managed to secure a part-time job, which helped him support his parents, though it was far from the life of comfort they had once enjoyed. Meanwhile, my life remained steady, and I focused on my career, free from the chaos they had brought into my world. In my free time, I started a blog about handmade crafts, something I had always been passionate about. To my surprise, the blog gained attention, and soon I was earning extra income, doubling what I made each month. Requests for me to teach workshops and courses poured in, and I found myself busier than ever, but in a way that brought me joy and fulfillment. I had no plans of remarrying. After everything I'd been through, I realized that I was content navigating life on my own. One day, as I was going through old belongings, I came across an old household account book from the early days of my marriage. Flipping through its pages, I was reminded of the financial struggles Charles and I had faced together, how hard we had worked to make ends meet back then. But instead of feeling sad, I felt a sense of resolve. I had come a long way since those early days, and now I was building a new happiness for myself on my own terms. I placed the account book back on the shelf, knowing that I had closed that chapter of my life for good, ready to embrace the future with confidence.